The year was 1729, and the small Baltic port city of Stettin, tucked away in the Kingdom of Prussia, was still shrouded in the damp chill of early May. In a modest but well-kept house near the old fortress walls, a newborn girl drew her first breath. She was christened Sophia Augusta Frederica, the first child of Prince Christian. August of Anhalt-Zerbst, a respected but not wealthy officer in the Prussian army, and Princess Johanna Elisabeth of Holstein-Gottorp, a woman with courtly ambitions far beyond the provincial life they lived. From the moment she could open her eyes, Sophia's world was filled with the strict order of a Prussian military household. Her father, though gentle in nature, was a man of discipline, instilling in her a sense of duty and restraint. Her mother, on the other hand, was charming and restless, always dreaming of higher stations and better connections. Little did either of them know that their daughter would one day rise far beyond the limits of their imaginations, to sit on the throne of the largest empire in the world. A mind unusually sharp. Sophia's childhood was not one of lavish wealth, but it was rich in education. Tutors came and went, teaching her French, the language of diplomacy and the aristocracy, as well as German history, literature, and the arts. She absorbed it all with the hunger of a mind that seemed far too large for the small, cobbled streets of Stettin. Even as a child, she displayed a remarkable memory and a knack for reading people's intentions. When visiting dignitaries stopped by her father's modest court, she would listen quietly to their conversations, noting the subtleties in their tone, the way they chose their words. It wasn't just the stories they told that fascinated her. It was the politics behind them. Restless dreams. Sophia's mother, Johanna, longed for the life of a grand courtier. She often told her daughter that marriage was not just a personal affair, but a political weapon, the key to unlocking influence and power. These lessons, whispered while sewing or walking in the garden, left an imprint on the young girl. At night, Sophia would imagine herself beyond the narrow Prussian walls, traveling to glittering palaces in Vienna, Paris, or even St. Petersburg. She had no way of knowing that destiny was already arranging the pieces of the chessboard, slowly guiding her toward a stage far greater than she could imagine. First glimpse of ambition. Her father's military career brought occasional changes of scenery, but life was often predictable, until whispers began to reach even this quiet corner of Prussia. Word spread that Empress Elisaveta Petrovna of Russia was seeking a bride for her nephew and chosen heir, Grand Duke Peter of Holstein-Gottorp. For most young girls in Europe, this was the stuff of fairy tales, but for Johanna Elisabeth, it was a call to action. By a stroke of fortune, Johanna was related to the Russian royal family through distant ties, enough to secure an invitation to the Russian court. More importantly, she believed her daughter Sophia was the perfect candidate. The molding of a princess. From that moment, Sophia's upbringing took on a new intensity. She was drilled in etiquette, court manners, and the subtle arts of flattery and conversation. She learned how to move gracefully across a ballroom, how to lower her gaze just enough to seem demure yet confident, and how to maintain an air of calm even when the situation was tense. Her education also became more strategic. She studied Russian history, the Orthodox faith, and the customs of the empire she might one day serve. Johanna knew the Russian court was a place of intrigue and shifting alliances. If her daughter was to survive there, she needed to be more than beautiful. She needed to be brilliant. Foreshadowing the storm, Sophia was still just a teenager when she began to understand the nature of power. She saw how her mother charmed local officials to gain favors, how her father navigated military politics to maintain his position. Power, she realized, was rarely about brute force. It was about perception, influence, and knowing the right moment to act. It was a lesson she would carry all her life, one that would one day help her seize an empire. The summons in the winter of 1744, the long-anticipated message arrived. Empress Elisaveta formally invited Johanna and Sophia to travel to Russia. The journey would be long and treacherous, across frozen rivers and snow-covered plains, but it was a chance that could not be refused. On the eve of their departure, Sophia stood at her bedroom window, looking out over the sleeping city of Stettin. The wind carried the distant sound of the harbor bells. She knew she was leaving behind not only her home, but also the girl she had been. In her place, she would have to become someone else, someone sharper, stronger, and infinitely more ambitious. Departure into destiny. The sleighs were loaded before dawn. Sophia wrapped herself in a heavy fur cloak, the icy air biting at her cheeks as she stepped outside. Her mother, already seated, gave her a nod, not of comfort, but of expectation. As the sleigh pulled away, Sophia felt the first stirrings of the life that awaited her. Ahead lay the vast, glittering empire of Russia, the mysterious Grand Duke she had yet to meet, and a court filled with rivals and opportunities. She could not have known that within 2 decades, she would no longer be just a guest in that empire. She would be its ruler. And so, with the snow crunching under the runners and the horizon glowing faintly in the east, the little princess of Stettin began her journey toward becoming Catherine the Great. The winter of 1744 was one of the coldest Europe had seen in years. Rivers froze so solid that carts could cross them as if they were roads, and the wind carried an edge sharp enough to bite through fur and leather. In the little Baltic port of Stettin, Sophia Augusta Frederica prepared for a journey that would take her into a world she had only imagined in her most daring dreams. The invitation from Empress Elizaveta Petrovna was more than a royal courtesy. It was a lifeline into a destiny Sophia's mother had schemed for since the day her daughter was born. The Empress sought a bride for her nephew, Grand Duke Peter of Holstein-Gottorp, the heir she had chosen to inherit the throne of Russia. For Johanna Elizabeth, Sophia's ambitious mother, there was no question. They would go, and they would win. The long road east, the departure was set before dawn, when the streets of Stettin lay silent under a blanket of snow. A train of sleighs, their runners glinting in the pale moonlight, carried Sophia, her mother, and their modest retinue eastward. The journey was brutal. Days blurred into nights as they crossed frozen landscapes that seemed to stretch into infinity. The wind roared across the plains, stinging exposed skin and numbing fingers, even through thick gloves. At night, they stopped in draughty inns or the homes of minor nobility, where Johanna would charm their hosts, always dropping hints about their imperial destination. Sophia, for her part, bore the hardships with quiet determination. She understood, even at 16, that a lady who aspired to a throne could not afford to appear weak. Each mile they traveled felt like a test she had to pass, a proving ground before the greatest trial of all, the Russian court. First glimpse of the Neva. Weeks later, the sleighs crested a rise, and the frozen sprawl of St. Petersburg came into view. The city shimmered in the weak winter sun, its grand palaces and domed churches gleaming against the whiteness. The Neva River lay locked under a sheet of ice, and sledges raced across it as though it were a boulevard. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She had seen nothing like it. The sheer scale, the foreign beauty, the way the city seemed to be carved out of frost and gold. But beneath her awe, she felt a ripple of caution. This was no provincial town. This was the heart of an empire, and empires devoured the unprepared. The Empress appears. Their first audience with Empress Elizaveta took place in the Winter Palace, a labyrinth of marble halls, gilded columns, and glittering chandeliers. Sophia's mother fussed over every detail of her daughter's dress, pale silk trimmed with ermine, chosen to flatter her youthful complexion and to subtly echo the imperial style. When the Empress finally entered, all conversation in the vast room fell silent. Elizaveta was a vision of majesty, tall, resplendent in a gown heavy with jewels, her presence commanding without a word. Her eyes swept the assembled guests before coming to rest on Sophia. For a long moment, the two women, one at the height of her power, the other barely on the threshold of womanhood, regarded each other. Then the Empress smiled, a slow, knowing smile, and beckoned the girl forward. The Grand Duke, if Sophia had been captivated by the Empress, her meeting with Grand Duke Peter was far less inspiring. Thin, pale, and awkward, Peter seemed more interested in his toy soldiers than in the young woman presented as his prospective bride. He spoke haltingly, with an enthusiasm reserved for military drills and tales of his beloved Prussia. Sophia masked her disappointment behind perfect courtly manners. Inside, she understood something critical. Her future would not depend on Peter's affection. It would depend on her own ability to win over the Empress, the court, and the powerful factions that swirled around the throne. Learning the game the Russian court was unlike anything Sophia had experienced. It was a place where every gesture could carry a double meaning, where friendships could turn to betrayals overnight, and where survival depended on reading the unspoken as clearly as the spoken. Sophia learned quickly. She listened more than she spoke, observed before she acted, and never forgot a face or a name. Her fluency in French and German impressed the courtiers, and she began to pick up Russian with remarkable speed. Each new word was a thread binding her more tightly to her new home. A new name, a new identity and a grand ceremony. Sophia converted to Russian Orthodoxy, taking the name Catherine Alexeyevna. The moment was symbolic. She was no longer a foreign princess from a minor German duchy. She was now a daughter of Russia, at least in the eyes of the church and the court. Yet deep within, she remained the same determined girl from Stettin, observant, ambitious, and patient. She understood that in the great game of empires, the pieces moved slowly, and the wisest players bided their time before making their move. Foreshadowing, as the winter of 1744 gave way to spring, Catherine settled into her role at court, her path toward marriage to Peter seemingly assured. But she also began to sense the undercurrents of discontent, whispers of political factions, rivalries for the empress's favor, and the ever-present reality that in Russia, a crown was never worn without risk. She did not yet know it, but the journey that had begun in a snowy sleigh from Stettin would lead her not just to a marriage, but to a throne seized in her own right. And somewhere deep in her heart, Catherine was already preparing for the day when she would no longer play the role others had written for her, but write the script herself. The summer of 1745 arrived with the fragrance of lilacs, drifting over the gardens of St. Petersburg. The city's canals gleamed under the long northern sun, and the imperial court buzzed with anticipation. The Grand Duke Peter of Holstein-Gottorp was to be married to the newly christened Catherine Alexeyevna, the young, intelligent foreign princess who had won the empress's approval. The wedding was a spectacle befitting the heir to the Russian Empire. The halls of the Winter Palace overflowed with silk banners, gold leaf decorations, and the hum of hundreds of voices. Courtiers jostled for position, not just to witness the ceremony, but to be seen witnessing it. For in the Russian court, visibility was a form of currency. Catherine, radiant in a gown of silver brocade, moved through the rituals with the precision of a trained actress. Every curtsy, every glance was measured. Outwardly, she was the perfect bride. Inwardly, she felt the first pangs of doubt. The Grand Duke revealed marriage stripped away the thin veil that had hidden Peter's character. He was 21, but often behaved like a boy, obsessed with Prussian military drills and the legacy of Frederick the Great. His chambers were littered with toy soldiers, miniature cannons, and maps of battlefields he would never see. Worse, Peter was erratic, sometimes sullen and withdrawn, sometimes loud and boisterous, often after too much drink. His temper could flare over trivial matters, and he seemed uninterested in both governance and his new wife. For Catherine, whose mind was sharp and ambitions quiet but vast, this was a sobering revelation. She had not married a future emperor, she had married a liability. The isolation life in the Russian court could be cold even when the sun was high. Catherine found herself isolated, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting who were loyal to the empress or, worse, to Peter's circle. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. Rumors bloomed like frost flowers on glass, delicate, intricate, and cutting. Her mother Johanna, who had been her most vocal ally, soon fell out of favor with the empress and was sent away. Catherine was left alone in a foreign land, with a husband she could not trust and a court that watched her every move. The quiet student, but Catherine was no helpless victim. She treated her isolation as a form of freedom, the freedom to observe, to learn, and to prepare. She devoured books from the palace library, histories of Rome and Byzantium, treatises on governance, works by Voltaire and other Enlightenment philosophers. She began to see patterns in power, how it moved, how it could be seized, and how it could be kept. She noted which ministers truly influenced the empress, which generals commanded loyalty in the army, and which courtiers could be swayed with charm or favors. Winning allies, Catherine knew she could not rule alone if fate ever handed her the chance. Quietly, she cultivated friendships with key figures in the military and among the nobility. She practiced the art of making people feel valued, a smile, a shared confidence, a subtle reminder that she remembered their name and their children's names. Her beauty opened doors, but it was her intellect that kept them from closing. The more people realized she listened, truly listened, the more they sought her company. These were the seeds of a network that would one day help her seize the throne. A marriage in name only by the early 1750s, it was an open secret that Catherine and Peter lived largely separate lives. Peter immersed himself in military games and infatuations of his own, while Catherine maintained her composure in public and pursued her studies in private. The lack of affection did not wound her so much as it clarified her priorities. She understood now that her marriage was not the foundation of her future. It was merely the scaffolding she would climb to reach it. The first whispers of change as the years passed. The political climate in Russia began to shift. Empress Elizaveta's health was declining, and talk of succession grew louder. Peter, as the designated heir, should have been consolidating his position, but his erratic behavior alienated allies and emboldened rivals. Catherine listened to the whispers in the corridors. He is unfit. He is too German. The army will never follow him. She did not join in the gossip, but she stored each word away. In a court where perception was reality, Peter's image was crumbling, and Catherine's, by contrast, was rising. A private vow one winter night, standing at the frost-covered window of her chambers, Catherine looked out over the darkened city. The Neva lay frozen beneath the moonlight, silent and unyielding. She thought of her journey from Stettin, of the girl she had been, and the woman she was becoming. She made herself a silent promise. If ever the opportunity arose to shape Russia's destiny, she would not hesitate. She would not allow herself to be a pawn in someone else's game. She would be the player, and she would win. That vow would carry her through the coming storm, a storm that would sweep away the man she had married and place upon her head the crown of an empire. By the late 1750s, the Winter Palace had become less a home for Catherine than a theatre of masks, a place where words rarely meant what they seemed, and loyalty shifted like ice-breaking on the Neva. The Empress Elizaveta still ruled, but her health faltered with each passing year. Her once luminous beauty had faded into the heavy stillness of illness, and the court was alive with whispered speculation. What will happen when she is gone? For Catherine, these whispers were more than idle gossip. They were the sound of the ground shifting beneath her feet. She knew the succession would bring her husband, Grand Duke Peter, to the throne, and she also knew what the court did not dare to say aloud. Peter was spectacularly unfit to wear a crown. The Grand Duke's folly, Peter's devotion to all things Prussian, had become a running joke, and a dangerous one. At banquets, he spoke glowingly of Frederick the Great, even as Russia and Prussia were locked in bitter conflict in the 7 Years' War. He drilled his personal guard in Prussian uniforms, an act that infuriated Russian officers who had bled for their country. His outbursts could be crude, even insulting, aimed at those whose support he would desperately need when he ascended the throne. Catherine, ever watchful, said little in public, but in private, she noted every insult, every blunder. Peter was not only alienating the military, he was alienating the church, the nobility, and even the common people. Isolation turns into opportunity. Catherine's marriage had long been an arrangement in name only, but now the emotional distance was matched by a political one. Peter surrounded himself with a circle of sycophants, men who fed his vanity and encouraged his worst instincts. Catherine, meanwhile, built a very different kind of circle, discreet, loyal, and strategically placed. She befriended key officers in the Imperial Guard, cultivated allies among reform-minded nobles, and even won the quiet admiration of certain foreign envoys, who recognized her intelligence and political instinct. Her quarters in the palace became a quiet refuge for conversation, a place where trusted visitors could speak freely, where plans could be discussed behind closed doors. She listened more than she spoke, but when she did speak, her words carried weight. The spy's lesson in the Russian court: information was more valuable than gold. Catherine learned to gather it subtly. A remark from a chambermaid about a late-night visitor, a casual observation from a cook about which ministers dined together. Her sharp memory allowed her to weave these fragments into a map of influence. She could see which alliances were strengthening, which rivalries were brewing, and which men might stand with her if the tide turned against Peter. The strain of waiting, yet for all her preparation, Catherine understood the danger of moving too soon. The Empress still lived, and while Elizaveta had little personal warmth for her, she also had no desire to see the throne thrown into chaos. So Catherine waited. She endured the cold silences at dinner, the thinly veiled insults, the calculated humiliations from Peter's allies. Outwardly, she remained composed, smiling at ceremonies, attending church with pious devotion, maintaining the image of a dutiful wife. Inside, however, her resolve hardened. She was no longer merely surviving the court. She was studying it, preparing for the precise moment when she could act without failing. A dangerous misstep. In 1758, Catherine fell gravely ill after a particularly harsh winter. Rumors swirled that Peter was indifferent, perhaps even pleased, at the thought of being rid of her. Whether true or not, The gossip further eroded his standing among courtiers, many of whom found his callousness distasteful. When Catherine recovered, she found that her absence had paradoxically strengthened her position. People spoke of her endurance, her resilience. She had become, in the eyes of some, a figure of quiet dignity, the opposite of Peter's erratic immaturity. The world beyond Russia, Catherine kept an ear tuned not only to palace intrigue, but to the wider world. Russia's war with Prussia raged on, and every battlefield victory or defeat rippled through the court. She understood that foreign policy could break rulers just as easily as domestic missteps. When Peter praised Frederick the Great, even in the face of Russian sacrifices, Catherine saw the soldiers' jaws tighten. She knew the army's loyalty was drifting, and she made sure to be the opposite of Peter in their eyes. Respectful, composed, and unmistakably Russian in her sympathies. The Empress fades by the early 1760s. It was clear that Elizaveta's reign was drawing to a close. The once vibrant sovereign now moved with difficulty, her appearances fewer and shorter. In the corridors of the Winter Palace, the question was no longer if Peter would take the throne, but when. Catherine could feel the moment approaching like the slow, inevitable shift of a river's current. She had no illusions. Peter's accession would put her in a precarious position. He distrusted her, perhaps even hated her, and in Russia, a Tsar's dislike could be fatal. The quiet oath renewed. One icy evening, Catherine stood alone in the palace chapel. The flickering candlelight danced on the icons, casting halos of gold around the faces of saints. She bowed her head, not in prayer for deliverance, but in a vow to herself. If the throne must pass to Peter, then it will not remain his for long. She did not yet know how she would do it, only that she would, and when the time came, she would act with the precision of a blade striking in silence, and the inevitability of winter itself. The year was 1762, and the Winter Palace echoed with the muffled tread of servants and the soft clang of church bells. On January 5th, the long-ailing Empress, Elizaveta Petrovna, breathed her last. By dawn the next day, the heralds of St. Petersburg were already proclaiming a new sovereign, Peter III, Emperor of all the Russias. For Catherine, the moment was a paradox. The coronation of her husband meant the beginning of her most dangerous chapter yet. As Tsarista, her position was outwardly elevated, but the man she was tied to now wielded powers vast enough to destroy her with a single signature. The first moves, Peter wasted no time making enemies. In one of his first acts as Tsar, he withdrew Russia from the 7 Years' War, abruptly ending hostilities with Prussia, not in a negotiated peace that secured concessions, but in a fawning alliance with Frederick the Great. Russian officers who had fought and bled for years were stunned, their sacrifices suddenly rendered meaningless. To make matters worse, Peter ordered the Russian army to adopt Prussian military uniforms, replacing the traditional green coats with the blue of their former enemy. In a nation where the army's pride was deeply tied to its image, the change was an insult layered atop humiliation. Alienating the pillars of power, Peter's disregard for Russian tradition did not stop with the army. The church, he moved to secularize vast churchlands, stripping the orthodox hierarchy of influence and wealth, earning the cold hostility of the clergy. The nobility, though he issued a manifesto granting nobles freedom from compulsory service, his aloofness and open contempt for Russian customs eroded whatever gratitude they might have felt. The Guards regiments, once the loyal protectors of the throne, they chafed under his Prussian drills and suspected favoritism toward foreign officers. In a matter of weeks, Peter had frayed every thread that held the empire's stability. Catherine, in the shadows, while Peter blundered in the open, Catherine moved with the patience of a hunter. She appeared dutiful in public, attending ceremonies, standing beside him at formal events, but privately, she deepened her connections. She visited barracks under the pretext of charity, speaking to officers and guardsmen with respect and warmth. She made small but telling gestures, listening to grievances, remembering names, offering subtle reassurance that she valued Russia's traditions. Every handshake, every shared glance was a brick in the quiet fortress she was building around herself. The fatal distraction, Peter's fascination with Princess Elizaveta Vorontsova, a plain but influential mistress, became an open scandal. He flaunted the relationship, often keeping Vorontsova by his side during public functions, sometimes sending Catherine away entirely. Whispers began to circulate that Peter intended to divorce Catherine, and worse, that he might confine her to a convent, the customary fate for discarded royal wives. The thought was not just humiliating, it was dangerous. In the ruthless calculus of court politics, a sidelined Catherine would be vulnerable to exile, or worse, the seeds of a coup by spring. Discontent had reached a dangerous pitch. The Imperial Guard regiments, especially the prestigious Ismailovsky and Preobrazhensky, were grumbling openly. The clergy resented their losses, the nobility was uneasy, and the army distrusted its new Prussian-aligned commander-in-chief. Catherine began to meet quietly with key conspirators, among them Gregory Orlov, a charismatic officer of the Guards, and her devoted ally. Orlov and his brothers, along with seasoned military leaders, began mapping out how power might be seized, swiftly, cleanly, and in a way that could be presented as a defense of Russia itself. Peter's fatal journey in early summer. Peter left St. Petersburg for Oranienbaum Palace, a retreat where he indulged in days of military games and hunting. He seemed oblivious to the storm gathering behind him. Surrounded by his inner circle and foreign advisors, he behaved as though the throne were unassailable. Catherine knew better. She understood that the loyalty of the Guards was the linchpin of imperial power. If they turned, Peter would be powerless, a Tsar without an army. A tense calm. Through June, Catherine played her role to perfection. She smiled at court functions, exchanged polite words with Peter, and made no visible move against him. But beneath the calm exterior, preparations accelerated. Gold was quietly distributed to key officers. Messages were passed in coded phrases. Contingency plans were drawn for how to secure the palace, the treasury, and the person of the Tsar himself. Every hour, the risk grew. If word of the conspiracy reached Peter too soon, the coup would collapse, and Catherine's life would be forfeit. But if they waited too long, Peter might strike first. The spark. By late June, reports came to Catherine that Peter was openly discussing the divorce, and that documents were being drafted to strip her of her title and remove her from succession. It was the signal she had been waiting for. The decision was made. The coup would come in early July. The Guards would be rallied, the capital secured, and Peter confronted before he could act. The pieces were in place, the players were ready, and the empire stood on the brink of a change so swift and decisive that, within a single day, the ruler of Russia would be someone entirely different. The dawn of July 9, 1762, broke over St. Petersburg in a pale haze, the air heavy with the stillness before a storm. In the quiet corridors of the Winter Palace, a conspiracy that had simmered for months was about to erupt into action. Catherine Alexeyevna, Tsarista of Russia, in name but not in power, rose before sunrise. She had slept little, her mind replaying every contingency, every promise made, every risk accepted. By day's end, she would either be Empress of all the Russias, or a prisoner on her way to exile. The summons the plan had been to act days later, but a messenger arrived before dawn with alarming news. Peter III had learned of the plot. Worse, his orders to arrest Catherine might already be in motion. There was no more time for caution. Gregory Orlov burst into Catherine's chambers, his face pale but determined. "Your Majesty," he whispered urgently, "we must move now. The guard is ready." Without hesitation, Catherine agreed. She dressed quickly, choosing not the silks of a courtier but a simple riding habit and high boots, the attire of a leader, not a lady-in-waiting. Her hair was swept back, her eyes clear and focused. Rallying the Guards, the coup began at the Ismailovsky regiment barracks, where loyal officers had gathered their men. When Catherine arrived in her carriage, the soldiers cheered, the sound echoing off the walls. She stepped down, her boots striking the cobblestones with a sharp, deliberate rhythm. Standing before the regiment, she spoke not as a consort, but as a ruler. "Brothers, I come to you not for myself, but for Russia. The faith, the honor, the traditions of our great nation are in danger. Will you stand with me?" A roar of assent rose from the ranks. Swords were drawn, muskets lifted in salute. The loyalty of the Guard, the true source of power in Russia, was now firmly hers. The march to the cathedral. From the Ismailovsky barracks, the procession grew. Catherine rode at the head, flanked by the Orlov brothers and a swelling mass of soldiers. They moved through the streets of St. Petersburg, toward the Kazansky Cathedral, where the clergy awaited. Inside the cool, incense-scented hall, Catherine was formally blessed as the protector of Russia. The symbolism was powerful. She now had not only the army but the church behind her. In the eyes of the people, she was already their sovereign, securing the capital even as the cathedral bells rang. Catherine's allies moved swiftly to secure key points: the treasury, to ensure the funds were in loyal hands; the arsenal, to prevent Peter's forces from arming against them; the admiralty, to control the navy's movements. Messengers galloped through the city carrying orders in Catherine's name. By mid-morning, St. Petersburg was effectively under her control. Peter's retreat, meanwhile. Peter III was at Oranienbaum Palace, still unaware of the full scale of the revolt. Reports reached him in fragments. The guards had defected. The capital was lost. Catherine had been proclaimed ruler. At first, he dismissed it as exaggerated gossip, but as confirmation piled in, panic set in. He abandoned his plans for a countermarch and fled toward Kronstadt, hoping to rally the navy. It was a fatal miscalculation. Kronstadt's garrison had already sworn allegiance to Catherine. When Peter's ships approached, the fortress guns remained silent, not in welcome, but in refusal. The confrontation by evening, Peter was cornered at Ropsha, a small estate outside the capital. Catherine's envoys arrived with a simple choice: abdicate peacefully or face the consequences. Facing the reality that he had no army, no navy, and no support, Peter signed the document renouncing the throne. In a single stroke of the pen, the ruler of Russia became a man without a crown. The triumphant return, Catherine re-entered St. Petersburg, not as a consort, but as Catherine II, Empress of all the Russias. She rode in a gilded carriage, the streets lined with cheering crowds, guardsmen marching in perfect formation behind her. The city's bells pealed in celebration, their chimes mingling with the booming of cannon salutes. The people threw flowers before her carriage wheels. She had not merely survived, she had transformed herself from a foreign-born princess into the embodiment of Russian sovereignty, the new reality. That night, as torches flickered against the palace walls, Catherine walked alone through the grand halls of the Winter Palace. The rooms felt different now, not cold and watchful, but hers. Yet she knew the day's triumph was only the beginning. She had taken the throne in a blaze of speed and precision, but to keep it would require a lifetime of vigilance. Every ally she had gained today might one day be a rival. Every soldier's cheer might, in time, turn to discontent. Still, as she looked out over the moonlit Neva, Catherine allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Against all odds, she had seized the crown of the largest empire on earth, and tomorrow she would begin the task of making it truly her own. The thunder of July's coup had faded, replaced by the quieter hum of a city settling into its new reality. Catherine II, now Empress of all the Russias, moved into the Winter Palace as its undisputed mistress. The coup had been swift, but consolidating power would require a far more delicate and enduring touch. She knew that many eyes in Russia and across Europe watched to see whether she would prove herself a capable ruler or merely a placeholder in a man's world. Catherine had no intention of being a figurehead. Securing the throne, her first priority was legitimacy. Though the coup had been bloodless, it had still been a seizure of power, and such actions often invited countercoups. She worked to stabilize her position on three fronts. The army. Catherine lavished praise and rewards on the guards, regiments that had stood with her. Promotions were granted, salaries increased, and the loyalty of the military was tied directly to her personal favor. The church. She reassured the Orthodox clergy that she was a protector of the faith, attending services with public devotion and halting some of Peter's unpopular secularization policies, though not all. The nobility. She confirmed the charter of the nobility, granting the aristocracy privileges they valued, ensuring that their wealth and titles remained secure under her reign. This balancing act, appeasing the pillars of power without ceding too much, would become a hallmark of her rule. A mind for enlightenment, while Catherine had seized the throne through force of will. Her vision for Russia was shaped by ideas. She was fascinated by the writings of the French Enlightenment, and her private study became a sanctuary lined with volumes from Voltaire, Diderot, and Montesquieu. She began a correspondence with Voltaire himself, exchanging letters filled with wit, philosophy, and political observation. Though they never met in person, he became one of her greatest admirers, hailing her as a monarch who ruled not only with the scepter, but with the mind. The Legislative Commission in 1767. Catherine undertook one of her most ambitious projects, the creation of a legislative commission, tasked with reviewing and modernizing the empire's laws. She personally wrote the Narkas, or Instruction, a sweeping document that drew on Enlightenment principles: equality before the law, limits on torture, and the notion that laws should serve the welfare of the people, though the commission was ultimately dissolved before completing its work, in part due to the outbreak of war. The knackers signaled to Europe that Russia had an intellectual ruler determined to drag her nation into the modern age. Patroness of the arts, Catherine's court soon became a cultural beacon. She expanded the Imperial Academy of Arts, invited foreign architects to transform St. Petersburg, and began amassing a personal art collection that would later form the core of the Hermitage Museum. Her patronage was not limited to visual arts. She supported the theatre, literature, and scientific exploration. She sponsored the establishment of the Smolny Institute, the first state-funded higher education institution for women in Russia, reflecting her belief that education was essential to progress. Image and perception. Catherine understood the power of image, as well as any modern politician. Portraits of her were carefully staged. She was shown not only as a regal figure in coronation robes, but also as a wise lawgiver, a military leader, even a benevolent mother to her people. These depictions traveled across Europe, reinforcing her status as one of the continent's most formidable sovereigns. To foreign ambassadors, she was gracious but shrewd, capable of disarming charm and steely resolve in the same conversation. Challenges beneath the surface. Yet the early years of her reign were not without strain. The vastness of the Russian Empire meant that reforms conceived in St. Petersburg often stalled in the provinces. Corruption was endemic, and the condition of the serfs, the millions of peasants bound to noble estates, remained desperate. Catherine recognized the danger in this, but the reality was that her throne rested on the goodwill of the nobility, whose wealth was tied directly to serf labor. She could not move against them without risking the stability she had so carefully built. Foreign eyes across Europe, rulers watched her with a mix of admiration and caution. Frederick the Great of Prussia, who had praised Peter III for his loyalty, quickly adjusted to the new reality, exchanging letters with Catherine that mixed political calculation with mutual respect. Austria's Maria Theresa, though wary of Catherine's ambitions, acknowledged her as an equal, a rare recognition between two female monarchs in a male-dominated world. A reign taking shape. By the end of her first 5 years on the throne, Catherine had transformed the uncertainty of her seizure of power into a reign that promised stability, reform, and cultural brilliance. The Winter Palace glittered not only with gold, but with the hum of ideas, debates on law, governance, and philosophy. But Catherine knew that even an enlightened ruler could not escape the realities of empire. War was brewing on the southern frontier, and the Ottoman Empire's shadow loomed large. The next chapter of her rule would be written not in the salons of St. Petersburg, but on the battlefields and in the treaties that could redraw the map of Europe. The salons of St. Petersburg glittered with candlelight. The pages of Catherine's Nakas lay in the hands of foreign philosophers, and the Hermitage's walls were filling with treasures from across Europe. But outside the gilded walls of the Winter Palace, the Russian Empire's destiny was being tested, not in the arts or the law, but on the battlefield. Catherine had always known that to secure her throne and her place among Europe's great monarchs, she would have to expand Russia's borders and prove her strength in war. And beyond the empire's southern steppes lay a rival whose shadow had loomed over Russia for centuries. The Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman challenge, the Black Sea was the prize. For generations, Russian access to its warm water ports had been blocked by Ottoman control. Without it, Russian trade was bound to the icy grip of the Baltic or the long overland routes of the steppe. In 1768, a diplomatic dispute spiraled into open conflict. Catherine saw opportunity where others saw danger. Victory against the Ottomans would not only secure vital territory, but also cement her legitimacy as a warrior empress. The First Russo-Turkish War 1768-1774, Catherine's generals, including the brilliant Count Pyotr Rumyantsev, led Russian forces deep into Ottoman territory. The campaigns were brutal. Vast distances, harsh climates, and the constant threat of disease tested the endurance of her armies. On land, Russian victories at Laga and Kagel shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. At sea, an audacious Russian fleet sailed from the Baltic around Europe to the Mediterranean, destroying the Ottoman navy at the Battle of Kesma in 1770. For Catherine, these triumphs were more than military wins. They were political capital. She celebrated them in grand public ceremonies, honoring her generals and rewarding the troops, reinforcing the idea that under her rule, Russia was not only enlightened, but powerful. The Treaty of Kukok-Kanaka, 1774. After years of fighting, the Ottomans sued for peace. The treaty that followed was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Russia gained access to ports on the Black Sea. The Crimean Khanate was declared independent, in theory, but in reality fell under Russian influence. Most importantly, Russia secured the right to protect Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, a clause that would give Catherine and her successors a pretext for future interventions. It was the most favorable treaty Russia had signed in centuries. Catherine's prestige soared, both at home and abroad. The annexation of Crimea independence for Crimea proved short-lived. The region's strategic value, its ports, its fertile lands, its position as a gateway to the Black Sea, was too great to leave uncertain. By 1783, after years of careful manipulation and pressure, Catherine annexed Crimea outright. She celebrated the event with the same grandeur she had shown in her cultural endeavors, commissioning medals, paintings, and triumphal processions. Foreign courts reacted with alarm, especially the Ottomans, but Catherine was unmoved. Russia now had its warm water port, and with it, the ability to project power deep into the Mediterranean. The Potemkin vision, one of the architects of Russia's southern expansion, was Gregory Potemkin, Catherine's trusted advisor, lover, and lifelong confidant. Potemkin was more than a military man. He was a visionary, dreaming of transforming the newly acquired territories into thriving provinces. He founded cities like Sevastopol and Kherson, fortified Russia's hold on the Black Sea, and invited settlers from across Europe. His new Russia was both a strategic frontier and a showcase of imperial ambition. The Second Russo-Turkish War, 1787-1792, the Ottoman Empire, stung by the loss of Crimea, sought revenge. Catherine, now in her late 50s but as politically sharp as ever, welcomed the challenge. She toured her southern provinces with Potemkin, presenting herself as the empress who personally guarded her new lands. The war was hard fought, but Russian forces, under generals like Alexander Suvorov, achieved decisive victories, including the storming of Izmail in 1790, a bloody siege that became legendary in Russian military history. The resulting Treaty of Yassy in 1792 confirmed Russia's hold over Crimea and extended its frontier to the Dniester River, solidifying Catherine's legacy as a conqueror. The image of the warrior empress back in St. Petersburg, Catherine ensured that these victories were not merely military footnotes, but part of a larger narrative. She commissioned portraits of herself in armor, laurel wreath upon her brow, and ordered the construction of monuments celebrating Russia's liberation of Orthodox lands. European diplomats, once skeptical of the woman who had seized power in a coup, now recognized her as a ruler who could hold her own against any king or emperor. The price of empire yet expansion came at a cost. The wars strained Russia's finances and placed heavy burdens on the peasantry, whose lives changed little despite the grandeur of imperial victories. Resentment simmered, especially in the vast rural heartlands, foreshadowing unrest that no ruler could fully contain. But for the moment, Catherine's star was ascendant. She had taken Russia from the frozen ports of the Baltic to the warm waters of the Black Sea, reshaped the map of Europe, and secured her place as one of history's great empire builders. While the banners of Russian victory still fluttered from the southern front, a far darker wind began to stir in the empire's vast interior. In the endless steppes of the Volga and the Urals, lands far from the gilded halls of St. Petersburg, resentment had been smoldering for decades. Here, the peasants bore the heaviest burdens of the empire. Bound by serfdom, they were little more than property in the eyes of the law, their lives dictated by the whims of landlords. Taxes were crushing, military conscription relentless, and the promises of reform whispered during Catherine's early years had long since faded. Into this tinderbox rode a man who would set it ablaze. The pretender emerges. His name was Yemelyan Pugachev, a former Don Cossack with a weathered face, sharp eyes, and a voice that carried over campfires and open plains. In 1773, Pugachev began claiming to be Peter III, Catherine's deposed and supposedly murdered husband. The real Peter was dead. Catherine knew that better than anyone, but for the serfs and Cossacks, the lie was powerful. If the rightful Tsar lived, they reasoned, then Catherine was a usurper, and rebellion was not treason but justice. Pugachev promised to abolish serfdom, free the Cossacks from imperial control, and restore a Russia where the people were not crushed beneath the weight of nobility. To those who had nothing, he promised everything. The steppe ignites. What began as a small band of followers quickly swelled into a full-scale insurrection. Peasants, Cossacks, runaway serfs, and even non-Russian tribes joined the cause. They attacked imperial garrisons, seized towns, and executed landlords in brutal spectacles meant to inspire fear as much as vengeance. By the winter of 1773 to 1774, the rebellion had captured Kazan, one of the largest cities in the Volga region. Imperial authorities seemed to be collapsing in the steppe, and whispers reached St. Petersburg that the rebels might march north toward Moscow. Catherine's dilemma. For Catherine, the rebellion was more than a military crisis. It was a political and symbolic one. She had built her image as a ruler for all Russia, enlightened and just. But now, tens of thousands rose against her, waving the banner of a man she had replaced. She could not afford to show weakness. At the same time, she understood that crushing the revolt would require more than brute force. It would demand restoring the perception of imperial control. The general's ride. Catherine dispatched some of her most capable commanders, including Alexander Suvorov, whose speed and precision in the field were legendary. Imperial forces swept into the Volga basin, retaking town after town. The fighting was savage. Villages suspected of aiding the rebels were burned. Pugachev's followers fought fiercely, fueled by desperation and the promise of a freer life, but they were poorly equipped against disciplined imperial troops. The fall of Pugachev. By late summer of 1774, the rebellion was crumbling. Betrayed by his own lieutenants, Pugachev was captured and brought to Moscow in a cage, a living trophy of imperial vengeance. On January 21, 1775, he was executed in a public spectacle meant to erase his myth once and for all. The man who had claimed to be the rightful Tsar died as a rebel, his body quartered, his name consigned to treason. The aftermath. Though the uprising was over, it left scars on Catherine's reign. Tens of thousands had died, towns had been razed, and the countryside was littered with the burned-out shells of estates. The rebellion hardened Catherine's stance on serfdom. If she had once entertained the idea of reforming or easing the system, the uprising convinced her that the nobility's loyalty was worth more than peasant discontent. The institution of serfdom would endure, and in some ways, tighten under her rule. A lesson in power for Catherine. The Pugachev rebellion was a grim reminder that the greatest threats to an empire often come from within. The wars against the Ottomans had expanded Russia's borders, but Pugachev had shown how fragile unity could be when injustice festered. In the Winter Palace, the Empress resumed her cultural and political projects, but the steppe remained in her thoughts, a vast, restless sea that could never be entirely tamed. The year was 1790, and Catherine II had reigned for nearly 3 decades. The girl who had once arrived in Russia as a foreign-born princess was now one of the most powerful sovereigns in the world. From the icy Baltic to the warm waters of the Black Sea, her empire stretched farther than any in Europe. She had outmaneuvered courtiers, deposed a husband, defeated the Ottomans, annexed Crimea, crushed rebellions, and turned St. Petersburg into a glittering capital of art and ideas. Yet even the most formidable reign must face the quiet encroachment of time, the unfinished dream. Though her armies had triumphed abroad and her court dazzled Europe, Catherine remained haunted by one reform she had never achieved, the abolition or reform of serfdom. In her early years, she had spoken of improving the lot of the peasantry, but the Pugachev rebellion had convinced her that the nobility's support was indispensable, and the nobility's wealth rested squarely on serf labor. Each year that passed made reform more distant. She could reshape Russia's laws, build schools, and commission palaces, but the lives of millions of serfs remained locked in hardship. It was the one shadow on an otherwise brilliant legacy. The final stage of expansion. Even in her 60s, Catherine's ambition did not fade. She pressed Russia's influence into Poland, participating in the partitions of Poland alongside Prussia and Austria, wiping the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth from the map. The empire grew again, its borders swelling with new territories and peoples. Catherine saw herself not only as a ruler, but as a lawgiver of nations, bringing Russian governance, and, in her mind, civilization to the frontier. Rivals and admirers in the courts of Europe, she was both feared and admired. Frederick the Great called her the Semiramis of the North. French philosophers hailed her as an enlightened monarch. Even enemies acknowledged her political genius. Her correspondence with Voltaire and Diderot remained a point of pride, a testament to her belief that ideas could shape empires as surely as armies. The matter of succession, Catherine's relationship with her son, Paul, was strained. She doubted his temperament and feared that he might undo her work. There were whispers, never proven, that she considered bypassing him in favor of her beloved grandson, Alexander. But fate would deny her the chance to settle the matter herself. The final days in November 1796, Catherine's routine began like any other. She rose early, attended 2 state papers, and conferred with ministers. But on the morning of November 16th, she collapsed in her private chambers, stricken by a massive stroke. For hours she lay unconscious, the court in turmoil, ministers shuffling between whispered consultations and urgent prayers. On November 17th, Catherine the Great, Empress of all the Russias, was gone. She was 67 years old. The funeral of an empress. Her body lay in state in the Winter Palace, robed in imperial regalia, the crown of Russia resting above her brow. Thousands filed past to pay their respects. Nobles, soldiers, foreign dignitaries, and commoners alike. Some came out of genuine grief, others out of duty, but all understood that they were witnessing the passing of an era. The legacy. When Catherine had first set foot in Russia as a teenage girl from Stettin, she could not have imagined the scale of the transformation she would bring. Territorial expansion. She added over 200,000 square miles to the empire. Cultural renaissance. She made St. Petersburg a center of European art, literature, and philosophy. Political power. She navigated one of the most treacherous courts in the world and ruled for 34 years, longer than any Russian empress before her. Her reign had its contradictions. She embraced Enlightenment ideals, yet left serfdom intact. She championed education yet maintained autocratic rule. But these contradictions only deepened the complexity of her legacy. The eternal empress. In the centuries since her death, Catherine's image has shifted and evolved, from the usurper who seized power in a coup, to the enlightened monarch who modernized her empire, to the warrior empress who bent history to her will. Statues of her still stand in Russian squares, her name etched in gold on monuments and libraries. The Hermitage, her greatest cultural gift, remains one of the world's treasures, a living testament to her passion for beauty and knowledge. And perhaps that is the truest measure of her greatness. Catherine did not simply reign over Russia. She reshaped it, leaving behind a legacy that would echo across Europe long after the Winter Palace's candles had burned down to smoke.